there's some pluses and there's some minuses, but also one of the pluses is that you can get back. So feel free to use it at any time. And if you want to say anything in the flow of conversation, just throw it in there. It's not for me. And I will read it, respond to it, and so on. I'm sure everyone's a little bit maybe tired of post-shirt adventures and all that.
Oh wait, I should like make
it bigger into the mid-semester kind of activity. I'll talk more about the paper. I think next week is probably better sense.
I don't think I can make them louder.
We should make it louder. And there's this other thing or downside.
Things to think about for that. In the meantime, let's do some psychoanalysis today.
I don't know how. You're welcome to though, if you do.
I want to mess with it.
Oh, whatever.
I can hear him though.
We're still. Okay, so, alright. Maybe there's probably one or two more people who will arrive. I'll just keep an eye on my email from time to time and see if they're having any tech issues, but that's good. Everyone's here? All good? Yeah. Okay. So here we go. Just a few things just to bridge our conversations over the last few weeks. I think it bears reminding ourselves that one of the things that new criticism was so invested in, again, was this idea of the poem or the novel as a self-contained whole, and that reading sort of would develop that wholeness. You'd sort of, through all the different tropes and even irons, technically don't cohere into a whole, but should sort of point to a kind of fragmentation. Nonetheless, you would still find your way to arrive at some sense of a whole of that artwork through the sort of close in-depth reading you gain. And finally, that would sort of be the model for actually like this humanist flourish. So if everyone could close read and everyone could, it wasn't that difficult to do. You didn't have that much of a special training. It's kind of accessible to everybody. It's really this beautiful humanist kind of project, and in a sense gives us a very positive, let's say the English department gives it a very positive motive. Like, we're here to spread humanism. We're here to sort of allow people to have kind of aesthetic appreciation and feel good about that, and feel confident about their reading skills or whatever, and they can enjoy the work. Because even though it may be complex and have this and that kind of going on in it, sort of the takeaway at the end would be that you've achieved a sense of wholeness, or a kind of fusion, I would say, of like your humanist moral selfhood with because you of course are like a unified whole. You are a unified whole, you fit into a unified whole, and you've read the work of art as a unified whole. And you achieve all this lovely synthesis there. Okay. Well, is that your theory of art? Is that your theory of reading? What if you think that the text doesn't deliver that for various reasons? And maybe those reasons are linguistic, and of course today, in part, we're also going to say that those reasons might be psychoanalytic. Or maybe the word is not exactly linguistic, but philosophical, or as Holderman likes to say, it's between the rhetorical and the semiotic, literal. Between the rhetorical and, let's say, the literal, or the grammatical or the semiotic, sometimes kind of those are all three sort of sometimes the same thing in his mind. Sort of might say that that's the like big structure of language is the semiotic or the grammatical, and the rhetorical is the sort of figurative and interpretive side of things. And it's in the play between those two that you really get actually the sort of explosion of meaning. this should be familiar. I'm really just reminding you, but it already, I think, like lets the cat out of the bag. That's the right metaphor by showing that we're not. Close reading is actually not about splitting holes, and it's not necessarily then this humanist project of having this almost like fulfilled self, and the self as like this autonomous kind of achievement of kind of organization, that's the right word or something like that, or I don't know if the right word is control exactly, but it's just simply with someone like Derrida and Deman, and you get a lot of sense of I would call it exactly contradiction, but just sort of like an endless iteration of possible meanings and readings and connections and needing to rethink your positions over and over again. We talked about that at the end of that class. It's sort of like a Nietzschean moment. You get that endless proliferation of having to return to the text and think it and read it and having to return to yourself and so on and so forth. And it doesn't mean that that can't be a humanist project. I mean, I certainly think it can, although sometimes people call that anti-humanism too, for various reasons. Maybe we'll get into it. Okay, so anyways, along those themes, I think we're going to see a similar thing going on in psychoanalysis, where we're not really going to see a unified theory of the self, or maybe we will. We'll see in terms of Freud. Is this humanism, or is this sort of like the breakdown of the humanistic kind of okay, well, actually, really quick, just last thought before, it's just, when you're reading someone like Derrida or any theorist, really, I think, the challenge is enormous. The challenge is simply, what the heck do we do with this as literary theorists and critics and so on? Because, as you know, it's to just apply it this way. Like, I read this Derrida essay, and I have these two Derrida terms, and I will apply them to this poem, and reading done. We know that that just doesn't sound like the answer. That doesn't sound like the method that we're looking for. Why? I mean, I wish it were so. I wish it was that simple. But it usually turns into something a little bit boring or a little bit, like, you might say mechanical, where you're just taking terms, sticking them here and saying, oh, look, I found these here, and done. And we've lost all the sort of adventure, let's say charm and creativity and exploration of what these theorists are doing. But that just means it is incredibly hard to use this material. And you have to sort of, we see them inventing methods, which are very complex and like take a lifetime for these theorists to implement. And then we're supposed to sort of not only understand them, but sort of reinvent them in our usage of them at the same time. That's a big task, because like, I'm still actually in the understanding phase of my life. Like, I don't know if I fully understand these theorists. It'll take me, I'm sure, a lifetime to just understand them, let alone apply them, let alone reinvent them, let alone invent my own way through them. So, but that's what we did. That's the task. Okay, so just like that task is for any particular theorist, it's going to be for psychoanalysis and for Freud and Lacan. So here we go into our Freud. Hopefully, Vincent, I know that you are having tech problems there. Hopefully it's working. Okay, so with your Freud hat on, you can recognize that psychoanalysis it's not the same thing as literary theory. It has a clinical side to it. So psychoanalysis might have let's say, two sides to it, clinical and a descriptive. So it's descriptive, it's theorizing the psyche and the self, and things like desire and so on, as well as bigger scale, like not just individual psyche, but like the group psyche and maybe the cultural effects of that group psyche and so on. And then, of course, the clinical side, meaning the therapy side. So I guess it also maybe helps to mention that Freud is sometimes in the same boat as us literary theorists over and over again, where it's like, is what Freud doing, is it science? Is there really a method to this? And sometimes Freud will use the language of science, and sometimes he will avow that he's not sure of what he's doing, or that it's not exactly a science. And then it's just innovative ever since day one. Like, if it's not a science, then it's what? Is it useful? Is it meaningless? Is it literature? Is it poetry? Is that a bad thing for it to be not a science? Or can it be a good thing? Some people said, oh, it's not a science, therefore it's wrong. It's Freud's genius sort of grown. It's not uninteresting, even if it's broad, but it's certainly not like a department or like a real practice that anybody could conceivably study and learn and apply. It's sort of like strictly tied to Freud's own skill set or something like that. And so it's not reproducible, and you get this sort of very familiar debate in our situation. Okay, so without further ado, let's take a look at some. Oh, well, maybe I'll just last point say is like, you may not like Freud, you may think it's old, and you feel like you want to throw it away. And for various reasons, maybe you think it's a fraud, or maybe you just get tired of. But obviously, he sort of has a second or third life in the English environment. It's fascinating. I mean, it's almost. He actually comes and goes in psychology departments, and I think he's finally arrived in 100 years later or so. He's finally been accepted in psychology departments like now, and they will sort of teach this work there here and there. And 20 years ago they wouldn't, because it was like empiricism all the time. You want data. You got to do brain scan, and you don't see the unconscious when you do an MRI. So it's all lies and so on. And so they were really just like data science, like that's what psychology is all about. Hard evidence, empiricism, and this stuff is like sort of poetry language. But I think now they've decided, well, actually, maybe pure data is not going to tell us everything about the psyche. And they're sort of, okay, maybe Freud does have something to do after all. Okay, so we can look at one of his early texts, Tradition of Dreams. And I, unfortunately, have a slightly older edition, so my page numbers are making it a little bit even more difficult in terms of just my page numbers. So I'm not up with yours, so I just might ask someone to read for us that first paragraph.
Just like from the beginning?
Yeah, just the first paragraph. Yeah.
Okay. In my experience, which is already extensive, the chief part in the mental lives of all children who later become psychoneurotics is played by their parents. Being in love with the one parent and hating the other are among the essential constituents of the shock that psychical impulses which is formed at that time, and which is of such importance in determining the symptoms of later neurosis. It is not my belief, however, that psychoneurons differ sharply in this respect from other human beings who remain normal, that they are able to, that is, to create something absolutely new and peculiar to themselves. It is far more probable, and this is confirmed by occasional observations on normal children, that they are only distinguished by exhibiting on a magnified scale feeling of love and hatred to their parents, which occur less obviously and less intensely in the minds of most children.
Okay, Chris. Yeah, that's good. Okay, and just a quick sort of takeaway here I'll ask everybody is, what's he saying about what he calls the difference between psychoneurotics and everyone else? Is there an important difference that he's pointed out? What is sort of he setting up in this opening paragraph between those two? Sarah, go ahead.
Sort of that it's just a difference of scale, right? That like makes the childhood experiences are the same. It's just a matter of like how intense the experience is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, and this is it's very simply sort of stated in this opening here. I mean, but this is very radical. The implications are huge here, and you probably totally grasp this already. And you probably maybe heard this before, but the implication is very radical in that it's saying everyone has these psychic phenomena, not just abnormal or neurotic or those who are deemed like pathological to some degree. So everyone has these these phenomena or these sort of like symptoms, and so we're going to almost essentially collapse the difference between like what's called normal psychology and abnormal psychology. And it's huge because it really is the first gesture where it's like none of this is really pathological in that it like the idea that being like these people are mentally different or biologically different. Maybe this leads to a whole set of things like racism and gendering and so on, and like we would maybe call like forces of separation or forces of oppression, where you decide someone is biologically or mentally different from everybody else, and they can do nothing about it. Right? They're stuck with that. That's the sort of pathological logic or mentality. And Freud is totally radically thrown away. And in some sense, it's like the ultimate humanist gesture, even just to start right there. It's like this is all of our psyches, and we're all in the same club. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. Okay, well then, not sooner than that. I mean, obviously, this is like a tiny slice of a 400-page text that Freud is publishing in 1899, 1900. And that's just after that, he goes into the following. He says, "This discovery is confirmed by a legend that has come down to us from a classical antiquity. A legend whose profound and universal power to move can only be understood if the hypothesis I have put forward in regard to the psychology of children has equally universal validity." So already again, he's reinforcing this. Like this universally applies to everybody, not just those people who are implicated in this legend or have read it or whatever. What I have in mind is the legend of King Oedipus and Sophocles' drama. So Oedipus Rex. So I'm not going to read this whole thing. I mean, just a nice refresher about this tragedy, and presumably more or less familiar with it. And as he says, I'm just skipping around here and there, he says, kind of at the end of the next paragraph, he says, all right, the action of the play consists of nothing other than the process of revealing, with cunning delays and ever-mounting excitement, a process that can be likened to the work of psychoanalysis. And Oedipus himself is the murderer of Laius, but further that he is the son of Perdiccas, so on and so forth. Okay, so the oracle is fulfilled. Oedipus Rex is what is known as a tragedy of destiny. He talks a little bit about that. And he says later, next paragraph, Oedipus Rex moves a modern audience no less than it does a Greek one. This is in part because there's something which makes a voice within us ready to recognize the compelling force of destiny in Oedipus. Well, we can't dismiss as merely arbitrary. Such dispositions are laid down in, he gives other examples, like this guy Gopardson. He goes on to say that his destiny, so Oedipus' destiny, moves us only because it might have been ours, because the oracle laid the same curse upon us before our birth as upon him. It is the fate of all of us, perhaps, to direct our first sexual impulse towards our mother and our first hatred and our first murderous wish against our father. Our dreams convince us that it is so. I was just going to pause here and basically ask you to maybe just say a little bit about how would you sort of kind of describe the way Freud is reading this text, this great tragedy. What does he do, let's say, as a literary theorist? What are some of his sort of takeaways after he's kind of given us the summary of Oedipus Rex? Or how do you rate him as a literary theorist? Any of those very interesting things about that. But basically, you could just say, what is he saying as a literary theorist? What did he extract from this particular topic? Okay, Sarah, you want to start?
Yeah, it seems to me that he's saying basically if the text endures enough, there must be something in it that is like an element of the universal human experience. And he thinks he's identified what the element of the universal human experience is in Oedipus Rex.
Okay, very nice. Yeah. Okay, which leads us to ask maybe, so what did he identify as that universal thing? So, but already one of his techniques to read literature is to universalize. And we just saw that a second ago with the opening paragraph, where he said, by the way, psychoanalysis is not about abnormal people per se, it's about everybody. So he's universalizing psychoanalysis. And then he's doing it with this example, literary example. But what is he, and then what is he saying? In universalizing Oedipus. Anyone want to give that and just fill it in? Maybe it's super obvious, which is totally fine. And I don't just keep
Like, is he just saying like presenting the Oedipal complex, like it's inevitable that men will desire their mother, whether they want to or not? Because he's saying like.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, he doesn't technically yet call it a complex, but in fact, of course, that's what he's sort of diagnosing here. And of course, yeah, it seems to be like gender and family-based theory. Like this is universal. Are all families like this? And then instantly you have to ask, is that true of all families? Number one. It's like, of course. Number two, is this true of all genders? Given that doesn't seem to. But of course, and he has that takes on all this. So already on the one hand, we might say, well, it's a really great thing for it is universalized because then everyone shares this sort of psychic phenomenon, and that's actually a good thing. Well, the second, now, hold on. Now that he's universalized, there's a big problem because if you're a female in this story, where do you fit? If your family structure isn't like this sort of nuclear family, like we know most families actually are not like this. Where does that fit? So suddenly there's a lot of problems with this. But we'll hold off on the problems, and we'll just, I think, there's a little extra thing we should pull out of this reading method, which is just that Freud has said that somehow this novel, or this play, this tragedy, is sort of like a collective dream, or that our dreams themselves convince us that this is also true. So somehow of course, this text is finding its place in the interpretation of dreams. This is not a dream. This is a play, but we're interpreting it as if it's a dream, and then also because dreams tell us so. That's a little slip there, or a little fast for me. But Freud loves to do that. Basically, kind of imply that dream analysis is not so much different than, well, he actually called literature waking dreams. So if that's the case, you are kind of reading, when you're reading a novel or a poem, whatever, you're reading a form of a dream. And when you're reading a dream, you're also kind of reading a novel. So, I don't know if I personally agree with that, but he's got that argument kind of embedded in his work. But then finally, just the second thing I think we can understand about this dream is that these are sort of not just individual dreams, collective dreams. Why are they collective? Is it because we have what we might call we all share a dream space or dream world? We all have a kind of collective unconscious? Probably. That's what he's arguing. But even if we have a collective, we sort of each encounter it in our own individual way. Alright, so he goes on to do similar reading of Hamlet, and I won't spend too much time on it. Hamlet actually struggles to do any action. Well, or actually, he can do a bunch of actions. He just can't do the one action he's supposed to do, which is kill the person who killed his father. And is he because he's hysteric? He's sort of stuck. Well, that's a possibility. I won't go into his theory of Hamlet or anything like that, but I just like to point out at the end of this reading of Hamlet, he says the following. He points out stuff about Macbeth as well. He just says that just as all neurotic symptoms, and for that matter dreams, are capable of being overinterpreted, indeed need to be, if they are to be fully understood, so all genuinely creative writings are the product of more than one single motive, more than a single input pulse in the poet's mind, and are open to more than a single interpretation. When I have written, I have only attempted to interpret the deepest layer of impulses in the mind of the creative writer. So it's interesting, he just sort of did this very wonderful snippet there by saying, like, okay, well, whether you're reading neurotic symptoms, whether you're reading dreams, whether you're reading literature, it's all going to be over-interpreted, or have multiple interpretations, or plural interpretations. Later, just a page or two later, he's going to call that over-determination. and you're going to have to use the same techniques to understand all the above. Okay. All right. Next section here, the dream one. Now, I will going to ask someone to volunteer to read that. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it's that section called the dream work. Just that first paragraph.
How much of it do I read just the first paragraph?
Yeah, just paragraph.
Every attempt that has hitherto been made to solve the problem of dreams has dealt directly with their manifest content as it is presented in our memory. All such attempts have endeavored to arrive at an interpretation of dreams from their manifest content, or, if no interpretation was attempted, to form a judgment as to their nature on the basis of that same manifest content. We are alone in taking something else into account. We have introduced a new class of psychical material between the manifest content of dreams and the conclusions of our inquiry, namely, the latent content, or as we say, the dream thoughts arrived at by means of our procedure. It is from these dream thoughts, and not from a dream's manifest content, that we disentangle its meaning. We are thus presented with a new task which had no previous existence. The task, that is, of investigating the relations between the manifest content of dreams and the latent dream thoughts, and of tracing out the processes by which the latter have been changed into the former.
Great. Okay, so you probably would guess what I'm going to ask you right now, which is just explain to me what is the difference between the manifest content and the latent content of the dream. What is the distinction between these two? Rashini, go ahead.
So manifest content, can you hear me? Sorry. Manifest content is dream content that you remember while waking up, whereas latent content is that which is repressed, and it is also like deciphered through a series of mechanisms which I think we are reading later on.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so yeah, I like that. It's sort of following what Rashini was saying there, that if you just wrote down your dream, you know, if you could remember it and kind of write it down in words or maybe even pictures or whatever, that would by and large still be the manifest content. Okay, but then if you just sort of sat and said, okay, what the heck does this mean? Well, then you're getting back to the latent content a little bit. Okay, so far so good. Alright, go ahead.
I think maybe this might be putting it a bit too reductively, but I think the manifest content is, like, you could understand it as being the denotation of the dream, and then the latent content is the connotation of the dream, because then you do have to do some series of interpretive steps in order to get to that. It isn't obvious, it isn't evident, it isn't self-evident.
Yeah, I think that's another good way of thinking about it, sort of denotation and connotation. There's obviously like a kind of two-layer analysis going on in here in Freud, and it seems like so evidently lined up with this two-part structure of the psyche, the conscious and the unconscious. So the denotator we went through, or the manifest, the sort of direct presentation calls it, would seem to be the conscious sort of manifestation of whatever was going on in your dreams, and the understand is latent, or deeper, or sort of interpretive aspect would be sort of attempting to arrive at the unconscious level, or the sort of unconscious meaning of the dream. I think that's the right way of thinking of it. I don't think we'd have to overcomplicate it too much, but this doesn't. I mean, the truth is the unconscious is this extremely difficult and very problematic space of the psyche for Freud. And even if we got to the latent content, we still, I don't think, directly access the unconscious per se. There's in a way you would never really directly access it. Okay, well, all right. Moving on though, I just want to read a little bit of the next section here. So the next paragraph, it says the dream thoughts and the dream content. Right, and dream thoughts are the latent, sort of, whereas the dream content is the manifest. So the dream thoughts and the dream content are presented to us like two versions of the same subject matter in two different languages, or more properly, the dream content seems like a transcript of the dream thoughts into another mode of expression, whose characters and syntactic flaws it is our business to discover by comparing the original and the translation. The dream thoughts are immediately comprehensible as soon as we have learned them. The dream content, on the other hand, is expressed as a word in like pictographic script, like images and so on. So I just stop there because my question as follows is, so first we said what's the difference between the manifest and the latent content? Now I'm asking you how are they related? How are they connected? Based on what you just said. How do we make sense of their connection? What are let's say the tools we might use to make sense of it? So Tim and Vincent.
He's sort of saying that one's translated from the other, in a sense, and he says, I mean, in the next sentence, he says that if we were to look at the dream content solely pictorially, we would be wrong to do that. Like, that would be an error. So we have to look at the symbolic relationship rather than just the pictures themselves.
Okay, very good. So, alright, so translation, you said, and kind of the symbolic mission. Very good. Vincent, you want to?
Yeah, I was thinking something kind of similar where the manifest is kind of like what you can make of the dream, but then the latent is like the meaning that is carried within the manifest. So kind of like the manifest acts as like a vehicle for the latent.
Yeah. So in some sense, I mean, there's sort of Freudian activity going on here in that sense of like, we'll see him sort of imply this when he gets a little bit more technical in a minute, but like the manifest is actually doing work for the side beam, so that the latent can also do its work to some degree. So based on what you're sort of thinking. Okay, Richie, I saw your hand. Go ahead. Alice, how these related?
Yeah, I was just trying to say that its manifest content is a distorted version of the latent content, which is presented in a less disturbing manner because
exactly. Yeah, that gets to sort of like, let's say, the psychoanalytic work that the dream is doing for us. It's sort of processing that latent stuff, which is a little bit too intense or too real or too traumatic maybe, but also or maybe too pleasurable, and too libidinal, and it just doesn't fit in like the proper society or proper reality, or even the image you have of yourself. And so there's sort of, it's being processed into the manifest so that we can at least confront it without sort of ruining us or scaring us or maybe just going, I don't know, getting us too riled up and too excited or whatever. Of course, the key word in all this, as just Tim had said from the get-go, was that this is like a translation. So again, this rings all sorts of bells for us literary people. Oh, okay, we have to do the work of translation. It's like these are almost two languages, the manifest and the latent. And Freudian analysis is a form of sort of like translation or like interpretive work. Of course, this whole book is called The Interpretation of Dreams. You know that, like, I love that word interpretation because that's what I think we do all day. We're sort of professional interpreters. Well, Freud is like one of those too. And but even the psyche is doing interpretive work. It's like it's translating or interpreting the latent into the manifest. And the job of the analyst is to sort of reinterpret that activity or interpret the interpretation work, if you will. Okay, so let's see a little bit more about how this interpretation work is happening. Which is the next paragraph. I'll have something that's work of condensation.
I can read it.
Okay.
The first thing that becomes clear to anyone who compares the dream content in the dream thoughts is that a work of condensation on a larger scale has been carried out. Dreams are brief, meager, and laconic in comparison with the range and wealth of dream thoughts. If a dream is written out, it may perhaps fill half a page. The analysis setting out the dream thoughts underlying it may occupy 6, 8, or a dozen times as much space. This relation varies with different dreams, but so far as my experience goes, its direction never varies. As a rule, one underestimates the amount of compression that has taken place, since one is inclined to regard the dream thoughts that have been brought to light as a complete material, whereas if the work of interpretation is carried further, it may reveal still more thoughts concealed behind the dream. I have already had occasion to point out that it is in fact never possible to be sure that a dream has been completely interpreted. If the solution seems satisfactory and without gaps, the possibility always remains that the dream may have yet another meaning. Strictly speaking, then, it is impossible to determine the amount of condensation.
Okay, very good. Okay, so my first question, as always, just to basically get some understanding, what is condensation? Anyone want to take that on? You guys have that?
Understanding, it's kind of like if you look at like the manifest content as like the tip of an iceberg, where like all of the latent content or the dream thoughts, as he says, are like the rest of the iceberg that's like hidden underneath the water.
Yeah.
And like from the surface, it's unable for you to tell like how much larger that iceberg is underneath the water. So it's like he's essentially saying that it's basically like the ratio of like manifest content to latent content is like really large, and we don't necessarily know how large it is.
Yeah, okay, great. I love that metaphor of the iceberg and the idea that there's a huge, vast sort of ice thing underneath what we might detect in the manifest. But also in the sense that the manifest is compressing or condensing all of that stuff, all that activity that is underlying it. It's condensing it into this thing, into this sort of much briefer thing, or smaller, or kind of you can encounter it in a sort of glimpse kind of effect, even though it might be this sort of big long thing that's underneath it. Okay, very good. There's another literal thing that's going on in condensation, as he sort of points out. It's like the idea that like you might have a dream, and if you wrote the whole thing out, it would be like a page, or even less, half a page, or something like that. But then if you did the analysis of it, it could take you 10 pages or 20 pages or whatever. So there's a kind of in psychoanalysis, there's a kind of, let's say, unpacking effect going on here, because the condensation is so, let's say, potent, and the analysis is it's like a different narrative register. The most obvious thing, okay, we use the word, I use the word compression or condensation all the time to talk about poetry or literature or speaker language, all the above. It's the exact same thing. So you can find a small metaphor, then you can spend a whole class, 3 hours of a class unpacking that one metaphor. Or like, William Blake, sunflower poem. What is a sunflower? Right? It's just a simple image or a simple plant or whatever, but we spend the whole day talking about what is going on with the sunflower. And he's talking to the sunflower, and what's the sunflower doing, and why is it this symbol of like love and like loss at the same time, so on and so forth. So one line, one reference, one image, whatever, many, that's what we do in literature. We do the work of unpacking condensation, or we're very good at that. And Freud does the same thing too. However, though, why does he say at the end of this paragraph that, strictly speaking, that it is impossible to determine the amount of condensation? Before that, he says, of course, the possibility always remains that the dream may have yet another meaning. Why? What's it going? What's going on there? I'm gonna ask that hallway. Oh, it's good. Like looking at a piece of art. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's like, in any artwork, it's you can sort of maybe see it in a glimpse, and then spend a lifetime interpreting it or engaging with it, understanding it. So yeah, it's the same, that work of condensation in all aesthetics. super powerful. That's basically kind of our bread and butter. But why does it mean prefer that actually it's impossible to terminate another conversation in that? What has he done? What has he done with his own method? What does he apply to knowledge?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just take a guess that maybe if you think about dreams as like pointing to something infinite, so you can't really like quantify like the infinite. Like you might be able to describe parts of it, but you can't really say I took 1/5 of the infinite. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure, yeah. I mean, yeah, you can't quantify it, you can't stop sort of analyzing. You'll never really know if you fully interpreted the dream, per se. I mean, I don't know if anyone wants to jump in here with further thoughts, but to me that's incredibly radical too. The implications are enormous, just with that statement. Here are some of those implications. Number one, analysis never stops. Okay? Which on the one hand might suggest like, okay, well the psychoanalyst always has a job, but actually it's maybe the opposite, which when people say, well look, then you're endlessly making it up, or you have no, if you have no sort of goal or rests, or endpoint, then you'll never know if you're doing it right. And you're always kind of in doubt of what you're doing. There's kind of like there's actually like a very kind of positive valence here, like I want to say like a radical goodness to interpreting forever, but there's also a radical skepticism to interpreting forever, because you never either feel adequate, or you just never get it, maybe you never get it, or you never get access to the meaning, or you never really understand anything, if you're endlessly interpreting. And it just, to me, it's the same position again of the English department. On the one hand, I think the truth of our method is that we should always interpret endlessly. We should never end. And that would be sad if we got Shakespeare and once and for all. It's about his son, Hamnet. And it's about Shakespeare's own biography, and it's about, Renaissance society and Hamnet, blah, blah, blah. If we got it and one answer, it would be sad. On the other hand, if we never really get it, if we never really understand it, then we have this perpetual skepticism or anxiety or doubt that is embedded in our method. So it's both a good thing and a bad thing. Right? And we saw this with Derrida too. He has this kind of thing. I think he is right that philosophy is endless interpretation rather than finding like once and for all a logic that is true forever. Okay, well, back to this. Anyway, I think there's a lot of radical things to still add to this that he's not sure if we ever really interpret the dream. But it just echoes back to what we're talking about with Helen a minute ago, where it was like you can always read and counter the art world and learn something new, which I think that sounds like a positive. Okay, one more little key aspect of the dream work is displacement. The work of displacement. Next few paragraphs. I guess I'll just read it here. It says, the paragraph, thus it's plausible to suppose that in the dream work, the psychical force is operating, which on the one hand strips the elements which have a high psychical value of their intensity, on the other hand by means of overdetermination, creates from the elements of low psychical value new values, which afterwards find their way into dream content. If that is so, a transference and displacement of psychical intensities occurs in the process of dream formation. And it is as a result of these that the differences between the text of the dream content and that of the dream thoughts. Remember, dream content is the manifest, dream thoughts is the latent. The text of the manifest and that of the latent comes about. And he says, the process we're pursuing here is nonetheless the essential portion of the dream work, described as dream displacement. Dream displacement and dream condensation are the two governing factors to whose activity would be in essence to describe the form assumed by dreams. Okay, so just again quickly, what does he mean by displacement here? Why is that part of the dream work? Condensation we got. It's like metaphors, like a work of art. It's endlessly analyzed. It's this dense thing, which you see just a glimpse of. Displacement? What's that about?
I think what he's saying is that, like, in dreams, the elements that have, like, a high intensity or a high meaning, like, a lot of meaning around them, are de-emphasized, and instead, like, more energy, more meaning is given to, like, the low-value elements, kind of, like, transferring where the focus is, or, like, the intensity or the emotion.
Yeah, I think that's nicely said. Yeah, so maybe displacement happens because something is too intense, or too powerful in the unconscious, or in the whatever psychic drives that you have, or the complexes you have, and it has to be displaced for you even to encounter it. Because again, direct encountering would just be essentially traumatic, or it would almost like Hamlet. It would sort of like prevent you from being you, or prevent you from acting, or prevent you from dealing with reality, or prevent you from absorbing whatever it's saying. The only way you can really absorb it is through displacement. It shows up in a different way, maybe it shows up. I didn't read this out loud, but he goes on to say maybe one of the reasons why there's displacement is because there's censorship going on. So this kind of fits with this translation issue and this two structure of the mind, the conscious and the unconscious. The unconscious is sort of bubbling up or boiling up to appearing as systems, but the conscious doesn't want it to do that. So it serves a little bit of censorship function. Later he'll call that the superego, sort of weeding out like the too much intense stuff coming from the conscious. And but it's just another thing we might have to analyze. What's being displaced and why and how and so on and so forth. But again, I don't know. I'm not a psychoanalyst. I don't know how important it would be in a way, but obviously like you have, for example, I have a recurring dream where like I move really slowly. Like I'm trying to go to my car and I can barely move my feet. It's only like 3 feet in front of me, but I'm just not arriving at that car. What does that mean? I don't know. Oedipus complex maybe? Who knows? But with place, not being able to walk very confidently to wherever I was going. So again, whatever images or narrative it was displaced from where the original came from, and it shows up as that. So you can already see that you can construct an entire coherent Freudian method out of all this poor literature, or literature.
Have a good day.
But nobody really, it's not the 30s and 40s and 50s where you just there used to be sort of Freudian literary analysts out there, but we're not like in that world anymore. We're not Freud at his word and so on. I don't know if I really want to read a poem as a dream, or vice versa, a dream as a poem. But, okay, so just moving on, and I should, just to keep the pace here, he goes on to say a few more things about dreams. He says they're not logical. I'm not going to read this anymore, but they're not logical, they can have contradictions. They don't have to get rid of contradictions, they can sort of sit with contradictions. In some sense, condensation is kind of, you can condense contradictions. You can condense time periods, past and present, or whatever, any form of, you can have two simultaneous presents, I don't know. You can do all sorts of effects with condensation, displacement, and so on, in terms of not having to worry about being logical or being there, like linear in time. But I think it's clever, I don't have, you can do a lot more of these things than just sort of apply this one-to-one, but you can say narrative time is really compressed. Like reading a novel, it's like 200 pages, and that's the difference between what actually might be the time in the novel, which could be maybe over a year or something like that. But you get this double effect of like short time and long time, compressed displacement. Some people also have argued that like the whole effect of the narrative is like rising action, falling action, and energy sort of bubbling up and then kind of dissipating or something like that. You can use all sorts of Freudian things with aneurology. And I think that's still interesting. There's still potential in that. Okay, so I'm going to stop with that text and move on to the uncanny. Okay, so your last point there, absolutely, yeah, it's very Nietzschean. I mean, it's obviously a huge influence on him. At one point said, I never really read Nietzsche, I never really read it well. It's clearly like Nietzsche says like all language is interpretation. Remember from that author's demise in a moral sense. It's very interesting. Okay, so the uncanny is very dense text. You probably read it before. I want to say, it's actually show of hands. How many people have read this one before? A little more, about a half, a little more than half. Okay. So, a little more than half. So, okay, that means I think that's okay if we go a little faster, even though you all know this is super it's so fun to think about. But alright, anyways, he begins by saying the uncanny is a kind of aesthetic term. So think of our typical aesthetic term, like sublime. You would add the uncanny in there. But he says if we turn to so it's in a feeling, it's a kind of feeling. But and I won't read all this just at the beginning here, but he says if you look at the history of aesthetics, like you look at Kant, for example, or Burke or whatever, you're actually not going to find that much discussion of the uncanny. But it sucks. It's too bad. There's a theorist that we're actually going to encounter later in this, nearly almost the end of this semester. Her name is Scam 9. I'll just put her in the chat. She has a book. Her first book was called Ugly Feeling, but and her second one was like I forget it now in a second. But anyways, her whole project was to theorize what she calls minor affects. And so ugliness is like it's a minor affects and minor aesthetics. So ugliness, uncanniness. She has something on like even like stupidity. These are all feelings as well as aesthetic phenomena that like don't seem to be important enough for someone like Kant to deal with. But in fact, when you dig down, they're everywhere. Or she has as like a feeling and an aesthetic phenomenon. And so she also wrote another book on the gimmick, which is weird, but but anyways, all these sort of marginal aesthetic and affective things turn out, as she discusses them, to be in fact totally substantial and present and everywhere and actually really dominant. So to the degree that something like the uncanny might have seemed as minor to someone like Kant, well, by the modernist moment, it's everywhere. Every text is uncanny in modernism. And it becomes not just marginal, but it's like it's the dominant style of modernism. Freud is not going to make those claims verbally here, but we can see when he starts to make their claims. And CN9 is just great, and Freud's just great on this, but what it shows us is that like the minor aesthetics has a lot of, we can talk a lot about it. There may be more research there. In fact, I think there is. There's a lot to say. There's research that we could all do to develop. The uncanny has been covered probably a lot, but I'm sure that there are other minor aesthetics out there that you would feel would be important to you, and that we can take on huge importance. I mean, so for example, like scrolling. Scrolling is, sort of digital media activity that's like such a dominant thing we do today. And it has aesthetic effects on all of this. So what would those be? It has psychoanalytic effects on this. What would those be? And you can see how this, I say, could be the model for doing all sorts of new research. Okay, well, what the heck is the uncanny? He goes on quickly to say in the second paragraph that the uncanny is undoubtedly related to what is frightening, to what arouses dread and horror equally. Certainly, too, the word is not always used in a clearly definable sense, so that it tends to coincide with what excites fear in general. Okay, so it connects with what's frightening and what's fearful, what's dreadful and horrible, but it's not horror as such. Okay, so that's, by the way, another sort of maybe marginal aesthetic and affective term, horror or dread. But, okay, let's go on and find out what the heck it is. His one about aesthetics is quite interesting because aesthetics is usually attracted to, well, he says, what is beautiful, attractive, and sublime, those are actually feelings that are given positive to you. This is again where Cian and I goes back to what I'm reading. He says the uncanny is a feeling of repulsion and distress. Again, what Cian and I most ugly feelings, ugly aesthetics. And aesthetics seems to have repressed the ugly and made it distressful out of itself. Okay, anyways, he goes on to say that maybe he's trying to figure out what the heck this uncanny is. He likes to, see what people have said about it. He goes to this guy named Jensch, Ernst Jensch, and Jensch has written a paper about it. And Jensch says the following, sort of a few paragraphs later. So Jensch basically say that he says the uncanny is that class of the frightening which leads back to what is known of old and familiar. But Freud is sort of wondering, how is this possible in what circumstances the familiar can become uncanny and frightening? I shall show it follows. Skipping it again, he starts to sort of try and come up with a definition. Alright, the word uncanny is actually translated as the German unheimlich. And so how do we understand the unheimlich? Uncanny as sort of etymologically as well as definitionally. It's obviously the opposite of heimlich or heimisch. He says, the opposite of what is familiar, and we are tempted to conclude that what is uncanny is frightening precisely because it is not known and familiar. So can we define the uncanny by saying, by saying it's the opposite? It is opposite of what is familiar. It's frightening because it's not familiar. We haven't encountered it before. And he says basically this is what Jensch kind of comes up with. It's frightening because it's not familiar. So he says Jensch cannot get beyond the relation of uncanny to the unfamiliar. And he also ascribes the uncanniness to intellectual uncertainty. Later on, he'll give us some examples of that, but like dolls or automatons, robots. You don't know if they're alive or dead. So Jensch already describes those as uncanny, and they definitely are. So Jensch is right about that. But Freud thinks that this definition is not helpful enough. Jensch got stuck in a way. And then something needs to be added to the definition. And maybe I'll just, I could say right here, it's like what needs to be added is, I would say, the unconscious. It's sort of the whole of psychoanalysis. So Jensch has said, again, what is, the uncanny is what is unfamiliar, and as you know, what I go on to say, it's not choosing the unfamiliar, and it's not choosing the familiar. It's sort of being stuck between both the familiar and the unfamiliar at the same time. The simultaneous experience of something that's both familiar and unfamiliar. How is that possible to do both familiar and unfamiliar? Because it's a contradiction. Usually if it's familiar, it's not going to be unfamiliar. And usually if it's unfamiliar, it's not going to be familiar, per se. And somehow it's got both embedded in it. And Jensch didn't get that. He didn't get that far. And that's the whole point of the unconscious and psychoanalysis. Alright, anyways, then he goes on to do this long etymology thing from the Deutsche Sprache Wörterbuch in 1860, and it's fascinating to see Freud just cut and paste from his version of Wikipedia, basically. All this etymology stuff, and he goes like, Heimlich, right, what the heck does Heimlich mean? It means being at home, not strange, familiar, tame, intimate, friendly. It means family, it means familiar, and so on. It means animals, which are domesticated, which is interesting. Not wild. So there's a whole sort of panoply of Freudian stuff going on here. It means intimate, friendly, comfortable. These are the stuff you can see. Okay, cheerful, indeed. Okay, but that's definition 1. Definition 2 means concealed, kept from sight. To do something Heimlich is, i.e., behind someone's back. To steal away Heimlich. Heimlich meetings and appointments. To look on with Heimlich pleasure at someone's discomfiture. It's funny that's thrown in there because we would call that Schadenfreude with our use of our German into English. Taking pleasure in someone's discomfort or their own pleasure. And so suddenly definition 2 seems to completely oppose definition 1. To behave Heimlich as though there's something to conceal something. Then he goes on to say the negative, to arouse fear. That's sort of with the Heimlich. Well, alright, so Heimlich is also associated with magic, something secretive, something deceitful, something malicious, and so on. Finally, so essentially it's associated with the Heimlich, the opposite of the Heimlich. And the sort of definition 2 shades into that. And then we have shelling. It's kind of interesting compact phrase, full of condensations. Yeah, and Heimlich is the name for everything that ought to have remained secret and hidden, but has come to light. So that has, in some sense, the unheimlich has become Heimlich, but ought to have remained unheimlich. It's a twisted, nice, interesting definition. Anyways, he says, what interests us most in this long extract is to find that among its different shades of meaning, the word Heimlich exhibits one which is identical to its opposite, unheimlich. What is Heimlich, thus comes to be unheimlich. In general, we are reminded that the word Heimlich is not unambiguous, but belongs to two sets of ideas which, without being contradictory, are yet very different. On the one hand, it means what is familiar and agreeable, and on the other hand, what is concealed and kept out of sight. Okay, so I just paused here, and I'll just repeat and ask you, why isn't this contradictory? Why? On the face of it just says, what? It says, without being contradictory. Well, wouldn't we identify the unheimlich as contradictory? Yeah, right.
Or think about what Freud says, the uncanny is like this doubling that occurs, but it's a doubling of something that's been repressed, so it's something that you can't really call up consciously, and so there's a weird familiarity about it. So it's both something that's secret and unknown, but also something that's like, you know, new and terrifying, I guess.
Well, secret and known, but also known. If we're gonna say it's not contradictory, yeah. You sort of got us to a little further down the road, which is that this whole theory of where this is coming from, return to your press. Yes, that's right. But even before we've gotten there at the definitional level, it's not contradictory, even though it seems to be. It's both known and unknown, or secret and also kind of like homely. Tina, do you have your hand up? Hello?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to say the same thing, but also it reminds me of deja vu, which we at the same time, like simultaneously, we knew something, but it is also new to us. So just want it's pretty much to it.
Yeah. Well, also, not only is it known to us, but it's like a second time. It's twice known to us, and yet known for the first time, because that's the whole point. It's like, oh, this is kind of new to me, but it's also something I've known all along. I've twice known it. So there's this doubling, this twice thing, this knowing and not knowing. The home language is very important. So the Heim doesn't really come through the translation of the word uncanny. So sometimes we just translate it as homely or unhomely or something like that. It's very important. I mean, every form we use the word home, and domestic or something like that, and the place where you sort of feel most comfortable, feel like you're you. And yet it's the place where full of all this secrets and where you're not you, or the thing that is not you is there, or the scary stuff is there, or something like that. So the place where you're most comfortable, and also the place where all these problems happen. It's so condensing, like something like the Oedipus complex, for example. The Oedipus complex is so uncanny because it's like it's your house, it's your home, the thing that you're most familiar with, your parents, you, yourself. And then it's the thing that's disturbing all that. It's all this sort of secrets that are driving, the wanting to kill the father and take the mother, and so on and so forth. Freud loves these sort of homely dramas that are embedded in everyone's psyche. Maybe all like. Okay, well, then he goes on to just point out things. He throws in the fact that there's like the home can be the ghostly place. It's the familiar, but also the ghostly place. And finally, he just likes to point out, like, psychoanalysis loves to say that there's sort of like the opposites are, like, words actually tend on their own to their opposites. And phenomena, even in our psyche, often tends to sort of veer to the opposite at the same time. I'm sort of good at two things there, but he writes another essay where it's just like the primal words that we all have that have the most potency, are often connect with their opposite. And maybe an obvious one, like I'll just say nature and culture. Technically there's opposites. Nature is given, whereas culture is sort of made. Nature is sort of like already present, whereas culture is sort of like human-really produced or something like that, we might see these as radical opposites. But deconstruction, if that's what you want to use, or Freud, if that's what you want to use, or whatever, we can say, well, these are actually embedded in each other. Because is it our nature to have culture? So you can make the argument there, or is anytime we think we've identified nature, it's actually an object of culture, or vice versa. Like every time we talk about the psychologists love to do this and say people are addicted to social media. Well, it's because of their nature. Like it's because of the way the brain works. It's because of the neurons and the pleasure, endorphins and so on, dopamine effects. So we're constantly, swishing these supposed opposites, these antithetical truths. But anyways, finally, just sums it up in the next section where it says here with Yench again, it says it's the ambiguity, and Yench offers a good set of these kinds of ambiguities, like doubts whether an animate being is really alive, or conversely whether a lifeless object might not be animate. He infers in this connection with things like waxwork figures, constructed dolls, automata, people who have epileptic seizures, manifestations of insanity, because this seems to show that the idea that we're all sort of automatic beings, we're all kind of automatons or robots to some degree. Anyways, I won't spend too much time there because he goes on and on about this next thing, which is an example from E.T.A. Hoffman's short story, The Sandman. And you read the story, if not, you get a nice dense version of it from Freud. And I won't repeat the whole story plot. You more or less, it's pretty much easy to follow. And this is a kind of, it's almost like I guess I don't know enough about Sandman as like a fairy tale figure. Maybe Hoffman invented it to some degree, but maybe it's like a recurrent fairy tale figure driven culture. I don't know. But anyways, Freud has gives us the summary. I just highlight a few things that stood out to me. So all this happens in early childhood. Well, all this sort of tension builds in early childhood, where this Nathaniel character is told by his mother that if you don't go to bed, the Sandman will get you. The Sandman will poke out your eyes. But also, sort of his nurse or something like that kind of reconfirms it. So he's full of all this terrible tension. And my first reaction is who are these bad parents? And why are they bad parenting? Yes, do you raise your kids by telling them these horror stories? What is all going on with that? Why would people do that? Maybe they still do. I don't know. I have kids. But I certainly didn't read stories that was like, guess what? If you don't go to bed, grab out your eyes. Shut up and go to bed.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know. That sounds pretty brutal. Maybe we're better parents because we've gone through our Freudian, lessons. You shouldn't traumatize your kids to get them to go to sleep. But this is not the case in, late 19th century Germany or something like that. So they're bad parents. The other thing that stood out to me was that, what the heck is the father doing? We don't really get a sense of what his job is. He keeps inviting this lawyer over. This really shady secondary lawyer figure. And he's always doing something sort of looks terrible and seems to be like the Sandman. But then his father dies, when the Sandman was young, because there's an explosion in his study. It's like, I don't know about your study, but are you going to have an explosion in your study? But it's not actually told what the heck his job is. But why is there explosions there? I don't know, Tina, maybe you know the story better.
Yeah, I think he's an alchemist. So he's
yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So we infer, in fact, yeah. But it's sort of like shady science, even in like the 1890s or 1880s when the story is written. It's like no one considers that legit. So, but it's sort of like harkens back to pre-science, or alchemy is sort of between science and like literature in some sense, or art, science and art. It sucks that an explosion just happens to happen and so on. But obviously, this sort of that thing, that all that complex sort of reappears, later when he's sort of university age. He falls in love with this figure in the window and screws up the automaton and so on and so forth. So there's all this sort of layering and doubling and like multiple kind of uncanny effects in this story. Even around the doll, or around the eyes, or around two characters reappearing, Coppelius and then Coppola, or early childhood trauma and later university, or I guess he's considered adult at that point, adult life. The tower and so on. Okay, anyways, it all ends in tragedy, sadly. And that's, there's that. Maybe one other weird thing that stands out to me, though, is that Freud interprets the fear of losing your eyes as the fear of castration. It seems like a very Freudian move to say that. So loss of the phallus. But he says that weirdly. He's like, the self-blinding of the mythical criminal Oedipus was simply a mitigated form of the punishment of castration. The only punishment was that was adequate for him by the Lexiconius. So poking at your eyes is like a displaced version of castration. Well, first of all, it's not. You could just castrate Oedipus if you wanted to. Number one. Okay. And second is like, why is that the only punishment that's adequate for what Oedipus had done? Poking at his eyes or being castrated? Either one. It doesn't like, Oedipus has killed his father and slept with his mother, and that's the appropriate punishment? I don't know. Who knows what can you make of it, but that threw me a little bit. I don't know if there's any appropriate punishment for that, but why would it be castration? I have no idea. Okay, so Freud says, well, all this is sort of reviewing the Sandman. He's got this castration anxiety going on in this whole story. That seems to be like, again, the manifest story, all this uncanny action going on. The latent is Freud doing his Freudian thing and reading it as hitting these sort of core, unconscious I would say call them structures of exactly, but these core unconscious, I could call them drives exactly, but or not to call them complexes. One of your core unconscious complexes is this Oedipal and this fear of castration thing, and it reappears in the story. So that's something manifest. Or sorry, something latent. Okay, moving on. Beyond this story, I'm sure we'll cycle through it. After the story is done, he gives us a couple paragraphs later the following statement. It says, at this point I will put forward two considerations which I think contain the gist of the short story.
It's like
In the first place, is psychoanalytic theory is correct indicating that every affect belonging to an emotional impulse, whatever its kind, is transformed, translated, and so on. If it is repressed into anxiety, so it's translated or transformed or repressed. Your translation is also the word for repression. Into anxiety, then among instances of frightening things, there must be one class which the frightening element can be shown to be present, which recurs or returns. This class of frightening, and I wish I had the German there. Looked it up.
It's okay.
This class of frightening things would then constitute the uncanny, and it must be a matter of indifference whether that uncanny, what is uncanny was itself originally frightening or whether it created some other effect. In the second place, if this is indeed the secret entry of the uncanny, we can understand why the word's usage has extended das Heimlich into its opposite, das Unheimlich. For this uncanny is in reality nothing new or alien, but something which is familiar and old established in the mind and which has become alienated from it through the process of repression. This reference to repression enables us furthermore to understand that Schelling definition of the uncanny as something which ought to have remained hidden but has come to light. I think that's probably the best example of that phrasing. What is anything else about the return? That's probably it. So why is the repressed thing returning? That's my question. Why doesn't it just stay repressed? Why would it return? What is the return as opposed to what's
How do we even call that?
I think it's just that it has to return because it's undissolved. And so as long as it stays unresolved, it keeps presenting itself until it has been resolved. It's kind of in the on or subconscious, where it stays repressed, and until it's resolved in the conscious, it keeps this like cyclically repeating.
Okay, good. I think that makes sense. That may be the only adjustment I would suggest, because it seems to be sort of Freud's world, is that it never really is fully processed. So, in some sense,
it's true. I mean, I have my thoughts on Freud. That's definitely part of it. Is that I guess like he says that you need that that I guess that's kind of your what isn't it like what keeps you alive?
Yeah.
And so you need that conflict in order because it's what forms you.
Yeah.
It's part of your constitution. Yeah.
Yeah, and you and everyone else. Like again,
Yeah.
he said the reason we like Oedipus Rex affects us is because it's everyone's unconscious. It's everyone's story. It's everyone's dream. Yeah. So to the degree that the castration complex or whatever it is, whatever you're repressing, whether it's Oedipus complex or you name it, it doesn't ever stop. Essentially. So the return of the oppressed turns out to be everything, or permanent, permanent in the unconscious, and we're constantly battling it. It's constantly surfing, it's constantly being repressed, and it's returning, and it's repressing it, and so on and so forth, endlessly. And that's part of the reason why analysis is interminable. On the other hand, of course, we don't all walk around with, these symptoms that are like totally, ruining our lives. We do move on to some degree. We become adults. We have our own kids. We perpetuate it with them. Just kidding. Maybe he's wrong about the fact that like these are permanently in everyone's unconscious for all time, historically. He's wrong about that. On the other hand, maybe he is right to some degree, whether it's specifically castration or whether it's some other kind of uncanny ambiguity, or just the fact that everyone's desires is a little uncanny. It really is you, and it sort of like takes you out of you. That we're always a little bit repressing part of our desires and wishes and fears, and we're always kind of constantly facing them or encountering them. And to the degree that return of the oppressed is the model of the self that we have, that's we're all in Freud's world. Okay, so but it explains again this extra that Jentsch didn't see. He didn't understand that what's familiar and what's unfamiliar happens simultaneously. It's because it's the return of the oppressed. What is repressed is very familiar because you've encountered it before, because it's you, because it's everybody, because it's conscious, it's all of us. So it's very familiar. On the other hand, it's never familiar because you never really understand it. You never really have direct access to it. You're always repressing it. You're always censoring it. You're always translating it. You're displacing it, so on and so forth. So it's a fascinating, brilliant argument or study of the unconscious. He goes on the next page or the next paragraphs to just sort of add to this. Like there's other factors, not just castration complex, by the way, that you have. So even your fear of death is something you repress but returns all the time. But actually the opposite, which is sort of like the power of this is like primitive fear of the dead, but also almost like the primitive fear of what he sometimes calls animism. Which might be either the ability to make something alive or the ability to sort of speak it into life. And that he associates with primitive peoples, savages, sometimes he says. Primitive power of language. So, and here's a classic example of like, oh, I hate that person. I wish he were dead. I wish he were dead. Well, next week somehow he dies. And you're like, wow, I really have that power. That's ridiculous. I don't believe in that. But somehow I gave him a curse with my thoughts or my language or something like that. And it's a pretty rare thing, or maybe it's not dead, but like, I wish something bad happened to him. Death is a pretty rare thing. I wish something bad happened to him. Yes, next week something super bad happens to that person. So sometimes we believe in these primitive thoughts of the power of our thoughts, or power of language, or we believe in sort of animist things, and so on. And I put these scare quotes around all that because it's really somewhat annoying and obnoxious and degrading somehow to sort of call this primitive and associate. There's a lot of indigenous language being thrown about with Freud, the sort of armchair anthropology And on the other hand, he's also deconstructing that. He's saying it's not just primitive people, it's everybody. We all have this. So maybe a better word would be primal. These are primal things that everyone has. So-called primitive person or so-called modern person. So he is deconstructing the difference between primitive and modern. On the other hand, he's repeating some of that language too. It's a bit annoying. But what's interesting is we push on that a little bit and to say that indigenous peoples consistently do not distinguish between animism and inanimate. Rocks are animate, rivers are animate, trees are animate, stars, air is animate, winds are animate in indigenous ontologies, philosophies. So Freud has sort of briefly understood that, but converted it into his own sort of stuff. But today I think it's sort of like, well, we wouldn't call that uncanny per se. Or would we? Or maybe we would. I don't know. It's up to you. But some of the, let's say, framework of this entire argument seems to be best problematized. We certainly wouldn't call that returnably repressed. The idea that animism reappears over and over again in indigenous philosophy. It also reappears over and over again in literature, right? We treat, poems have all these animacy effects. Remember Barbara Johnson's argument about abortion? And that apostrophe is always animating the dead, also kind of de-animating that which is alive. So making others have voice, but also taking voice away from others, or displacing voice, and so on, and kind of like, or calling one's own voice maybe dead. It has all these doubling effects of animacy and intimacy in the voice, and apostrophe being addressed, and so on and so forth. So literature has all this doubling of the animated and the inanimate, which is this core uncanny thing. So I might just leave it at that. Freud does go on to say that, have the sex stuff on the fairy tales, so he actually does talk about fiction there, and actually says, and he has given us an example from fiction, from Hoffman, and in a way fiction's also fascinatingly uncanny because you never know if fiction is fiction or non-fiction, right? Isn't that the whole art of fiction, is to blend the effects? And as Freud has said, even when he's talking about Hoffman, he's like, is this a true story? I don't know. The writer always leaves that in suspense. So the degree that fiction and non-fiction, or truth and, I wouldn't say exactly lies, but again, like make-believe, or fiction, or fairy tales, whatever, the degree that is doubled in fiction, or in poetry even, that's what makes it art. And that's what makes it good art. And to the degree that we're never sure, it's ambiguous, what the line between fiction and non-fiction is. Forever. That's one of the like we would call structural or ontological aspects of fiction or literature or poetry or art or whatever. Then it's part of its psychoanalytic power on us. We might also say it's an aesthetic power and so on. And that's a good thing. And to the degree that you have to read doubly all the time, that's the definition of good reading, close reading, real reading. Finally, he just points out that he says people call psychoanalysis itself uncanny. He says this. A couple paragraphs later, he says that indeed, I should not describe psychoanalysis, which is concerned with laying bare these hidden forces, have itself become uncanny to many people for that very reason. In one case, I succeeded, though none too rapidly, here in a girl who had been an invalid for many years. I myself heard this view expressed by the patient's mother long after her recovery. So, once again, just like we thought that psychoanalysis and literature might have a lot in common, he even applies uncanny to himself. We might ask why, if you want. Maybe as we're sort of just closing this up. I hope you enjoyed your encounter with uncanny. This is probably your second encounter, your double encounter with uncanny. And Freud himself is avowing. So all of psychoanalysis seems to be embedded in uncanny. So what seemed to be a small thing, even Freud said that at the beginning, this is just sort of like a side thing that psychoanalysis should talk about. Now suddenly it's everything and everywhere. A lot of people like to point out that this whole essay is very uncanny. The style of this essay, for him to try and sort of pin down what the uncanny is, he keeps returning over and over to sort of problems of doing that. I don't know. Nobody wants to chime in here, but anyways, I hope you enjoyed the journey to the uncanny. And yeah, it's very pleasurable. Okay, one last little Freud thing is the fetish. And we'll take our break here. Before we just talk about this, let's just pause again and just say, well, that's the fascinating thing about Freud, is that first of all, he's a pleasure to read. He's a great writer. Second, that he talks about things that are so, I think, full of self-recognition. We read this and we're like, oh, that's me. Oh, I recognize that. Oh yeah, that describes me, and that's such a wonderful feeling to see that. That's what we get out of literature too. When we read a great work, a novel, or poem, whatever, we're like, oh, that's me. Of course, the process of self-recognition and self-understanding is deeply traumatized throughout Freud's work. Right? He recognizes himself being uncanny. The whole point of the uncanny is it's both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. You can't really recognize yourself, or to the degree you recognize yourself, you're not really recognizing yourself. Right? Because of all this sort of displacement thing, or doubling, or repressing, and so on and so forth. So it's wonderful. So like the takeaway from Freud is not that, oh, it just translates into self-understanding, because of course it's also translating into all this self-traumatizing or self-difficulty kind of thing. Effect. And it's all the more delicious because of that. And for people who would throw this away because it's not scientific, or because they just think psychology is moved on, psychology is better now, man, why would you throw that away? That's so sad. But most people don't read Freud. There you go. And fetishism. So this is sort of late Freud now. He's revised some of his sort of arguments and proposals on psychology over and over again. This is near the end of his life. Some of his late papers. They're just as fascinating as some of those early papers. The fetish. I guess I'll read it. Fetishism. In the last few years, I have had an opportunity of studying analytically a number of men whose object choice was dominated by a fetish. There's no need to expect that these people come to analysis on account of their fetish. For them no doubt a fetish is recognized by its adherence as an abnormality. It is seldom felt by them as a symptom of an ailment accompanied by suffering. Usually they're quite satisfied with it, or even praise the way in which it eases their erotic life. As a rule, therefore, the fetish has made its appearance in analysis as a subsidiary finding. It's so Freudian always to say, oh, by the way, this is a small thing. This is a subsidiary thing, not a big thing. People rarely come to talk about it. Sounds so right. And then soon he'll give an example, and it's like, oh, by the way, this defines all of psychoanalysis. And all of everything. So, everything. So he gives us a quick example. He says, a young man that exalted a certain sort of shine on the nose into a fetish condition. The surprising explanation of this was that the patient had been brought up in an English nursery, but later come to Germany, where he forgot his mother tongue almost completely. The fetish, which originated from his earliest childhood, had to be understood in English, not German. The shine on the nose, in German, glance is also to look or brief, but it's also to shine. It's like a shine. It's kind of been looking. Okay, glance off the nase, so shine on the nose. In reality, a glance at the nose. The nose was just the fetish. With that will, the luminous shine which was not perceptible to others. Okay, so this person has a nose fetish, but there's like a shining thing effect going on with the nose. But also, this so Freud. Here's a scene of translation right here. English to German, back to English, something like that. It's a scene of condensation. It's a scene of displacement. It's dream work, dream analysis. It's translation, as he said, the dream analysis is. It's so deliciously Freudian to just have to double this through English and German. It helps that word. It makes sense in English for us. And so on. And of course, then it's also Freudian that like this little 3-sentence description of the fetish will lead to any number of pages of analysis. Just like I said, the 2-sentence dream that you have leads to 10,000 pages. Okay, then he goes on to say that when I now announce that the fetish is a substitute for the penis, I shall certainly create disappointment. It's still a laughable sentence. Okay. Alright, well, I'll just go back a sentence. Okay. Alright, maybe I'll go 2 sentences back. Because in every instance, the meaning and the purpose of the fetish turned out in analysis to be the same. It revealed itself so naturally and seemed to me so compelling that I appeared to expect the same solution in all cases of fetishism. I.e., we all know what fetishes are. It's so easy. It's the same thing over and over again. Here's what it is. When I now announce that the fetish is a substitute for the penis, I shall certainly create disappointment. It's so common. First of all, when it's like you can almost hear like the sad trombone sound. It's like, and the fetish is the penis. Oh, it's like so cliche. He's already cliche. He already knows it's cliche. Like, what are you looking for? You're looking for the penis. Bravo. Like the pipe, or the cigar, or I don't know. Howard. People build log buildings, giant buildings. Or they build rockets. It's the penis. Rolling the rockets. There goes Freud again. But this is such a lovely psychoanalytics. Freud running his own cliche of himself. I shall
That
certainly
takes a lot of courage to do, honestly.
You can see this sort of work of analysis going on where it's like, should analysis be disappointed? No. It's always like surprising and like juicy and exciting. That's like the analyst is always delivering that song. By the way, isn't that what the critic is always delivering? Well, and also the work of art. The work of art is always giving you a little charge, a little wow, a little like frisson, a little excitement. And the good reading, and the critic is always re-delivering that. We're delivering it in its own version. That's why we have to reinvent the method. We want to reproduce that effect, that excitement that the artwork delivers to us. And yet analyze it at the same time. Freud is in that same boat. He's like, I want to deliver the excitement of the little charge from the unconscious or whatever, but also I want to analyze it too. And to the degree that he does it over and over again, it might turn into a cliche, so it loses all its little charge. So a psychoanalyst has to keep the charge, but also analyze it at the same time. The position of the critic, the position of the analyst, which is a little different than the position of the artist. The artist just wants to deliver the charge, to sort of spread that little bit of energy or whatever, or sort of pass it on to the reader. Whereas the critic and the analyst have to keep it and yet analyze it at the same time, which is really tough because everyone always says, you analyze it, you kill it. It's dead. You lose the life of the text. You lose the charge. So on and so forth. So the degree that Freud is in that same boat as us, it's so fascinating. And the degree that he just hacks it out right on this page in the sentence. When he says, when I announce the fetish as a substitute for penis, I should make disappointment. I won't be doing a good analysis, even if I get it right. If I fix analysis, it won't be very good because it will be and cliche. Doing the Freud thing over and over. And just like I think we have that same feeling for anyone. If your criticism were repeatable and obvious and expected, everyone would be like, not that good. You'd be disappointed, and that's what we don't want. It's just so fascinatingly obvious, just seen, and for us too. But it's so hard, just because it's so obvious doesn't mean it's easy. Freud's in the same way. It's like, how do I make this good? How do I get the libidinal charge back? Even though when I tell you it's the penis, and which is technically the most libidinal charge thing anyway. But it turns into the opposite. It turns into sort of just a commonplace. Well, he goes on to add a little extra, as you know he will do, to give you that libidinal charge. What's our little extra? Because he did the same thing with the uncanny, by the way. What was the extra? It was the return of the oppressed. It was the unconscious. The unconscious boiling up in its particular way. Well, what's the extra charge here? It's that it's not just the penis, but it's the following. It's a special kind of penis. He says, I hate that it's not a substitute for penis, but for a particular exploitation penis that has been extremely important in early childhood, but had later been lost. That is to say, it should normally have been given up, but the fetish is precisely designed to preserve it from extinction. To put it more plainly, the fetish is a substitute for the mother's penis. The little boy once believed in it, believes strongly, but does not want to give up. What happened therefore was that the boy refused to take cognizance of the fact of having perceived that a woman does not possess a penis. Okay, it's nothing like Freud doubling down on the word. Okay, You know, he's like, okay, on the one hand you think it's going to be the phallus. Oh, it is. But guess what? It was the phallus in the mother who the boy had seen, but realized that the mother does not have the phallus, but in fact refused to take cognizance of that. It's just Freud. It seems like Freud times 10 in this. Is any of this true? Probably not. Probably not. But on the one hand, I mean, we understand that the fetish is not just the phallus, but the phallus kind of put through this whole matrix of, you know, is the woman the castrated man? Is the man seeing someone castrated and identifying with that, identifying with the mother, identifying with himself? I don't know, all this stuff going on at the same time. So it's a little bit more than just the phallus. Okay, well, I don't know how comfortable you are talking about any of all this. It's not easy to talk about. It's not the most comfortable language. But I just wanted to come to one last big point about this. He adds a little bit of sort of
That's so funny.
interpretation going on here. And I'll just read a little bit more. He says, alright, the last sentence that I just read, first sentence in the paragraph. What happened therefore was that the boy refused to take cognizance of the fact that having perceived that a woman does not be, not that it could not be true. For a woman that had been castrated and his own possession of a penis was in danger, alright, blah, 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 blah. So, typical Freud stuff. Moving on. A few sentences later, he says, a new technical term is justified. So Freud says, okay, we need a new term for this. Not just fetish, but a new term for all of what he's describing. Right, a new term is justified, a technical term is justified when it's described in fact or emphasizes it. This is not so here. Okay, actually he says we don't need a new term. The oldest word in our psychoanalytic terminology of repression already relates to this pathological process. If we wanted to differentiate more sharply between the vicissitude of the idea as distinct from that of the affect, and reserve the word for drawing it and repression. Remember I was looking for that German word? that German word was for drawing it. The drawing it. My German is very weird. Repression. So the return of the repression. For the affect, then the correct German word for the vicissitude of the idea would be Verleugnen. And our translation for that is disavowal. Okay, so actually, technically, we do need a new term. It is disavowal. And he thinks that the fetish is all about the disavowal. He goes on to say a little bit, just skipping a bit. Alright, so this is the perception has persisted, and a very energetic action has been undertaken to maintain the disavowal. It is not true after the child has made his observation of the woman. He has preserved unaltered his belief that women have a phallus. So the child still thinks the woman has a phallus. That's what finishes. He has retained that belief, but he's also given it up. Well, okay, that sounds like a contradiction. Okay, so here I pause. Here I ask you, as a group, what do you mean by disavow? What is a disavow? What is this something? It turns out this is the key term. Along with it. What does it mean? A disavowal is what? It's not. He didn't invent it for this essay. He had already used it, but he sort of brings it back. He says, "All right, this is the key term." So this is sort of why he said we don't need a new term. But this is the essay where I think he really does crystallize the fact disavowal of it. And it is what? What is it about? Let me give it. And then we'll take our break. That's Freudian moment. Okay, Kelly, thanks.
I had to Google disavowal, but Google says it's like a refusal to acknowledge something.
Absolutely. Very good. So, as he says, it's just the boy refused to take cognizance of the fact that he knows that the woman is doing this. So he's not the disavowal is refusing to know what the boy knows. So maybe unless anyone wants to jump in here, I'll walk us through really quickly. So the boy knows that the mother does not have the penis. but the boy pretends as if the mother still had it. That's the disavowal. So the boy knows very well mothers don't have the phallus, and the boy pretends that the mother still has the phallus. By the way, the phallus is not necessarily the same thing as literal penis, but not that important. It's the same thing with the fetish, you might say. We might say, oh, I know that the nose is not the penis, but I'm going to pretend as if it is. I'm going to pretend as if I don't know that it's not the same thing as the penis. Okay? So it's that same disavowal logic over and over again. I know that this isn't X, whatever that X is, typically the penis or the phallus, but I'm going to pretend that it will be. Okay? So I know that shoes are not, I don't know, the female sex organ or even the male sex organ. Okay? But I'm going to pretend as if they are. That's the fetish. And that's a form of disavowal. It's actually a kind of doubling of the vowel and non-vowel at the same time. It sounds like the uncanny. The uncanny is a form of disavowal. Oh, it's familiar, but it's not familiar. I disavow that it's familiar. So disavowal actually becomes, once again, not the small thing, but the core of all psychoanalysis. And the core of all desire, you might say, or so on and so forth. I mean, you can get into all deeper for it, is this the terminology of the unconscious, of desire, so on and so forth. We don't have to go that farther into our Freudian world. But anyways, the logic of disavowal is articulated in this scene. There's a wonderful psychoanalytic theorist named Slavoj Žižek, who has written many, many times about this scene, this Freudian argument of the fetish, and the logic of the fetish, or the logic of the disavowal, and he sums it up with the neat phrase, I know, but still. I know, but still. So I know that the nose isn't the penis, but still I will pretend as if it is. Or I know that the mother doesn't have the phallus, but I will pretend as if she is. Or I know, but still, over and over again. It becomes the logic of the fetish. I know, but still. Freud has his own understanding of this. He thinks it has maybe to do with avoidance of homosexuality, but that doesn't make sense, and so on. Whether men have fetish, he thinks actually men have fetish and women don't seem to have fetishes. That's probably not true. I don't know. I'm not a psychoanalyst and all that stuff, but I skipped almost all the rest of it. And just linger again with this logic. I know, but still. I know, but still. And I just would say that it's actually very powerful logic and very real. And we use disavowal all the time. An obvious example would be environmentalism. It fits the I know, but still rationale or logic. So, for example, I know oil will not last more than, a generation or two. But still, I'm going to act as if it's that it's endless, and that I will drive in my car without worrying about it. I will not repress that anxiety or that so it doesn't have to do with castration or anything. You can have fetishistic logic or disavowal logic anywhere. So I will repress the fact that I'm well aware that apocalypse is around the corner, but I will pretend as if everything's fine. And that not just everything's fine, but that this will go on forever. Even though I know very well that it won't. And we all live in that fetishistic world. That's part of real life. That's why this is so powerful. Most obvious example would be money. Like literal dollar bills. I know that it's not, this has no value, and yet I pretend as if it has all value invested in it. So money, of course, Marx will talk about this soon enough. The logic of the fetish. He will go on to talk about commodity fetishism. So we'll see the logic of the fetish in Freud.
That's what I wrote on my exam.
Kind of
cool.
He has his own, Marx will have his own theory of commodity fetish. We'll get that later. I will just, the obvious one would be literature. Is a kind of fetish object, but instead of me saying why, I wanted to ask you, this is my last question, why might literature also work along the logic of the fetish? I want to give it a shot, Julia. Thanks.
I guess, if we're going along the lines of, suspension of disbelief back to, fiction, I guess if we're talking about, novels as fiction. Like we pretend that we know it actually isn't the real thing, but we pretend like these characters or like words mean anything. I guess like you could do like just like straight characters, like seeing them in your mind, like they're not real. But then you can bring that further to like the poetics, like do metaphors mean anything? They could be. We'll just to make it pretend and like make it up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So of course, on the one hand, fiction, these aren't real people, and you have to pretend they are. So that's form disavow or fetish. And I know that's still logic. Also, you can just a metaphor, just two random words put together. We could say we know that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it will vest it with the highest of meaning or something like that. There's kind of an I know but still moment there. All of reading kind of works through fetishism and this disavowal logic, and that's what reading is. Like we pretend it's something different, or we pretend it's alive, or we pretend it's invested with meaning when it's maybe just it's literally just words or something like that. We walk around all day, and also of course everything we read is really doubled in the sense that like this is a model for criticism. Criticism is a fetishistic act where we try to generate more meaning even though we're not sure it's even there, or we obsess over the literary objects for whatever reasons, or again we treat it as real, we know it's not real, and so on and so forth. So there's any number of ways we can apply that logic to our world to reading. And just to circle all the way back, just as Fred said, it's not like there's a difference between an accuracy and continuum. All of these sort of symptoms or these sort of extremes or these rarities, as he says about the fetish, this is a rare thing that you may never encounter in psychoanalysis. It turns out it's everywhere, in everything. And it's in all of our psyches, it's in all of our cells, it's in all of our language, it's in all of our critical acts, all of interpretation, which is what we do.